Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. I am recording from Southern New Hampshire yet again. Today, we bring you a recording with the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at the Harvard Divinity School. I went down to Cambridge yesterday and recorded with Professor Charles Stang and had a lovely time. This is such a fun interview for me. We went so many places I did not expect, and I think you guys will like this one. So there was so much. They recently had a conference on psychedelics. They've had a series, then a series I think a year or two ago. So regular kind of webinar style meetings, and then a smaller conference the year before, and a great interdisciplinary conference this year. So that's kind of what I was most interested in. So I'm happy to report we talk about much more than that event, and I go all over. So I hope you enjoy this one, and we will see you on the other side.
Vital, our 12-month certificate in integrative psychedelic studies, is back for its fourth cohort starting September the 17th, 2024. Vital is a process-oriented course with a deeply multidisciplinary curriculum that incorporates clinical, scientific, and relational domains alongside indigenous, shamanic, and transpersonal wisdom traditions. Vital is a vibrant community of students and alumni from around the world committed to merging powerful inner work with expanded professional scope of practice. Through lectures, study groups, webinars, elective modules, process papers, and online affinity groups, you'll have all the support you need to develop your own vision and model for lifelong growth in this exciting field. And new for this fourth round of Vital, we've introduced the option of choosing one of 5 specialization graduation pathways, which are regenerative business and leadership, depth and Jungian perspectives, somatics and trauma, spiritual emergence, or microdosing. Applications for Vital are open until August 23rd, with early bird discounts of $2,000 available until July 22nd. So we invite you to apply early to improve your chances of being accepted into this global community of the next generation of psychedelic-informed practitioners. Head to vitalpsychedelictraining.com to learn more about this transformative journey, download our full course curriculum, and to apply. Best of luck, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. We are recording today at Harvard University, and today I'm joined by Professor Charles Stang. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. This is fun. You are the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. And recently, that group came on my radar because of a conference that y'all hosted recently. We're going to chat about that a little bit. We're going to chat about your background and some pretty fun, diverse topics that I think my listeners will be excited about. So can you tell me a little bit about the center? What do y'all do at the center?
Yeah, sure. So the center was started in the very late 1950s at a time that the Divinity School was largely about teaching the history of Christianity. It was still very much a Christian seminary, and it was in something of a neo-Orthodox phase of its history.
Mm-hmm.
And the dean of the Divinity School negotiated to have the center established under the umbrella of the Divinity School, but very much as a kind of independent research and teaching unit. The aim of which was to promote what they called the sympathetic study of the world religions, or the world's religions. And the idea behind the center was to bring together scholars who were from these traditions to study and live alongside Divinity School students. So it's a residential community and a kind of research and programming hub. It's evolved. It's had many incarnations over I guess we're now like 65 years going, but it has always remained an intentional residence with diverse international visitors and students, and it's always had research programming and I should say, public programming, and then research initiatives as well.
Oh, that's great and interesting. So, like a sort of living anthropology of a sort, like you get to actually witness how they're evolving and changing and
Yeah.
doing what they do generally.
Yeah, and I think, it was started at a time when the study of the world's religions was still being done largely by white Christian men studying, let's say, Hinduism, Islam, what have you. And the center slowly began to bring in learned representatives of those traditions to the Western Academy and interact with the students and scholars. I should say that one of the things you may find interesting about the center is that I didn't know this until I became the director, but the anonymous gift that established the center, which was a really sizable gift in the late 50s, turns out to have come from a theosophical circle. The last surviving member of this sort of theosophical circle out of New York decided to give, they had pooled their resources and considerable resources. She decided to give it to Harvard to establish this center. So a few years back, we had a conference about theosophy and its relationship to the study of religion. And we were using that kind of story about the center as the occasion to speak more widely about theosophy and not just what has its relationship been to the study of religion, but maybe what are its lingering effects and influences, and are there lessons to be learned about what the study of religion can and should be from that earlier stage in its history.
That's interesting. For listeners, is there any kind of quasi-digestible explanation for what is theosophy?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
I never had an easy one.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Theosophy with a capital T is a movement that starts in the late 19th century in America, and it's a kind of forerunner to like the New Age. It's an eclectic and syncretistic form of religion and science, led by, most people have heard of Helena Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky. She and this other guy founded it, and it exploded. It spread like wildfire across the United States, Europe, the world, and then it fragmented into a million lineages and subgroups, and a lot of bad blood amongst them. But wielded a lot of influence for about 40 to 50 years.
That's great. The thing I was explaining to my folks earlier this morning was that it had, I believe, a profound influence worldwide, but particularly in India with inspiring Gandhi. Is that
accurate? That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want me to say anything more about that?
Sure, just a little bit, yeah.
I mean, again, this is something I knew better 5 years ago, but the early stages in Theosophy's history, they sort of trace their lineage to Egypt. And then Blavatsky has this turn and starts tracing Theosophy's lineage back to India. This is also coincides with this claim that she and others are in communication with these Mahatmas or masters, who I believe are said to live in Tibet, who send them letters. So anyway, they move the Theosophical Society to Adyar, India, where it remains. And it has a huge influence in India. Both theosophical ideas influence Indians, and theosophy is influenced by, obviously, it's Indian culture. But Gandhi was one. If I'm not mistaken, there's a story that Gandhi first read the Mahabharata with two theosophists. Somebody should check me on that. But again, there's a wonderful story. A wonderful book by Isaac Lebelsky called Celestial India, which tells the whole story of theosophy's entanglement with India and Indian independence. It's a great read.
That's great. Theosophy had an impact on me.
Oh,
so
really?
I used to spend a bunch of time at the Arlington Theosophical Society, a little north of here. I think that's north.
Yep.
And,
yeah.
Yeah, not necessarily hanging out with the Theosophists, but other stuff that was hosted there. And always been fascinated by Blavatsky, such an interesting, polarizing figure, but no doubt super influential. Yeah, quick tangent. Have you heard of this Lama? Goes by Mike Crowley. He wrote an interesting couple books, The Secret Drugs of Buddhism, and he there was another one too. I think Psychedelic Buddhism might have been the one he just came out with.
Yes, I haven't read either. I looked into him because I was curious about who was working at the intersection of Buddhism and psychedelics, and his name popped up.
Yeah, it's him and maybe two other people. I don't know the other names offhand, but it's great to see that it's getting developed a little bit and doing some unearthing of some interesting stuff that was going on in the past.
Yeah.
Perhaps now too. So back here, let's zoom back to Massachusetts and Cambridge. So what, I kind of want to talk about the conference first. So how did this like concept of psychedelics and the intersection with religion come to your table to the degree that you were interested or the center was interested in a conference?
Okay. So in order to tell that story, I have to back up about 3 or 4 years. So I've been running the center for 6 years. During the pandemic, I became aware, I'm sort of embarrassed how late I became aware of the research coming out of Johns Hopkins University around especially psilocybin, the therapeutic applications of psilocybin, and the way in which that research team was indexing their therapeutic results to what they were calling mystical type experience. That intrigued me because I'm a historian of the ancient world, and within that, the thing I focus on is, among others, the development of what we call mysticism. So I was kind of curious, this is a very influential, popular conversation about religion and specifically mysticism and its relationship to psychedelics. I should start tracking that. And so I started following that conversation. And at about the same time, Brian Marescu's book, The Immortality Key, came out, which is, you no doubt know, argues that beneath the vast panoply of ancient Mediterranean religions, there's a kind of invisible psychedelic substrate that explains what we witness. That too, I thought, well, this is a very influential, popular conversation about another area that I care about, namely the ancient Mediterranean world and early Christianity. I should begin tracking that. So those two things led me to think that the center should invest in a series. And it was in the pandemic, so I thought, let's do a Zoom series on psychedelics and the future of religion, in which we could try to have rigorous and responsible conversations about the intersection between psychedelics and religion, when I found like there was a lot of undisciplined and unrigorous conversation about that. So I figured we could try to hold a center for that. And that really took off. People responded really well to the topics and the speakers. And Roland Griffiths was our first speaker in the series. Brian Marescu was in that first year. Many others. So that sort of launched the ship, so to speak. And then several years down the road, 2 students came onto my radar who were really enthusiastic about the intersection of psychedelics and religion. They conceived of the very first conference at Harvard Divinity School, which wasn't this year, but the year before. And they're amazing. Jeff Bro and Paul Gillis-Smith are their names. They, so the first conference was an attempt to surface people from around this university, start locally, who around Harvard is interested in psychedelics. And so we tried to get representatives from all the faculties and schools and succeeded. So that was last year's. And the center supported them, but we supported them sort of late in the game. They had already kind of conceived it.
Was the medical school involved a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. Medical school was involved. Yeah. Franklin King.
He's a friend.
Yeah. Yves Bousson, or Yvonne Bousson. Who else? In any case, certainly those two and more. And then this year, we decided to have a second annual conference, and the theme was Psychedelic Intersections. And that name, which Jeff and Paul chose was meant to invoke the whole idea of intersectionality, that in some way working on one aspect of psychedelics implicates you in all these other aspects of psychedelics. So it was an attempt to show the integrity of all these different aspects of psychedelic research. And then they focused on 3 or 4 of those. And, this most recent conference was also the first year that the Harvard study of psychedelics in society and culture was underway. So we had the support of that very generous gift, the full weight of the center's staff and resources to help launch this conference. So the second one was much bigger and was a great success, I think.
That's awesome. So not much of a specific focus at this most recent one then.
There was the 3 themes were psychedelics and race, psychedelic underground. There was one I didn't share it. Psychedelics and ancient traditions. And there was one more that's escaping my memory right now.
Mm-hmm.
But we had 2 keynotes that maybe the other one was psychedelics. I think the other one was psychedelics and indigenous traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Our 2 keynotes were Luis Eduardo Luna from Huasihuasca, as I'm sure you know him, and Carl Hart from Colombia. So those were obviously speaking about psychedelic. In some ways, Luis Eduardo Luna was speaking about psychedelics and the underground, and of course, psychedelic and indigenous traditions. And Carl Hart was, among other things, talking about psychedelics and race.
Mm-hmm.
Those 2 keynotes were exquisite in my mind. I could say more about why, but I'll let you lead us through that.
Let's hear it about Carl Hart first. And I'd love to hear more about Luis.
Well, I read Drug Use for Grownups when it came out, and I found it really moving and persuasive. And I felt like it was really important that early on in this initiative and this study here at Harvard, that is in some ways celebrating psychedelics becoming legitimate object of academic inquiry, that it's important to acknowledge and wrestle with the fact that the very category of psychedelics, sort of speaking of these substances or drugs as a special case, participates in a very worrying trend in drug policy that has, grave unjust implications for people of color, especially. And so Carl Hart, I felt like it was important for the psychedelic scene to have someone give a kind of blistering critique of the first principle. Like, should we even be talking about these things together? And he did that eloquently, passionately, and persuasively. And he's also a very cool guy. And I really just enjoyed the time I had with him. So that was Carl.
There's very few people I fanboy over.
Yeah.
I think I saw him at Horizons a few years ago. I couldn't even get the courage up to talk to him, even though we had him on the show. And it was like my favorite interview ever.
Yeah.
Gave me his phone number and shit. I'm like, no, I can't.
I can't do it.
Too much of a fan.
Yeah.
But yeah, his arguments are so great. I think one of the most compelling parts for the psychedelic movement, despite the injustice, is a lot of visionary mystical traditions worldwide using other substances other than psychedelics for similar means. Opium particularly coming to mind, cannabis as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, in very substantial ways. And yeah, it's fascinating. I've been fighting psychedelic exceptionalism for a while now, and it's quite the fight.
I'm glad to hear you say that, as I joined this conversation very late and felt immediately like psychedelic exceptionalism was the oxygen that everybody seemed to be breathing.
In a lot of ways it is. Still.
Is it still?
Yeah.
Well, then keep up the good fight.
I'll try.
Keep up the good fight. And Luis Eduardo Luna gave a kind of, in some sense, it was a very wide-ranging kind of career retrospective. But the thing that moved me most in his talk was his discussion of new archaeological discoveries that are pointing to a level of a human civilizational imprint in South America that goes back considerably earlier than we had known.
Because we hear the number like maybe a couple hundred years, if not thousands of years, and it's tough to wrestle with.
Yeah, it is, and I don't want to speak for him or report on that scholarship, but it was like an axial shift for me to realize, okay, the situation in the Americas could be so much different than our textbooks have led us to believe. And so his lecture left me wanting to learn a lot more about these new movements in archaeology.
I'm not going to hold you to this, but like so we have the Beringian hypothesis where everybody came over the Bering Strait. Is he challenging that in some ways?
No, it's not that.
Okay.
No, it's more just that they're essentially, he was saying the jungle is much stronger than we recognize, and there is evidence that the jungle has absorbed more evidence of human civilization than we thought. So he gave this story, and again, I may have the details.
LiDAR radar work. That's
exactly. So some of this is about new techniques that allow them to survey land and see, whoa, what is lying under the jungle. So he told a story that really moved me, which is that there is I believe it's a 16th century Franciscan who goes up the Amazon, and he has a narrative of what he saw. And he reports on like very large human settlements, perhaps even cities, as I recall. And then this report this narrative was it didn't have a huge impact in its day. And it was, so to speak, rediscovered in the 18th century. And people read it and they said, this must be sort of a fantastic tale. Like, this is a Franciscan exoticizing the ancient. No, there weren't cities. He's doing like a Herodotus for the 16th century. This didn't happen. He didn't witness this. He's creating a tale, a tall tale. And Luis Eduardo Luna said they're actually now, certain scholars are going back to this and saying, perhaps we should take this tale seriously and try to follow out where he was, because precisely what I said earlier, the jungle may have overtaken a lot of this, and we should take these reports more seriously. So apparently there are new estimates of the population of South America that place it much higher. City centers having many more people than we thought. Again, I'm way out of my field. I can't vouch for all this. All to say, it was really interesting and really fascinating to talk about a kind of deep civilizational history in Central and South America, and also the way in which there was very, very established networks of trade and communication between Central, South, and North America. So potential to rewrite some of what I had been taught about the Americas.
Yeah, it's good. He teaches for us, or has at least in the past, a bunch, and I think we'll have him on the show again soon to report on this. I love that.
Good.
He's definitely a fascinating character. So something more specifically Harvard-y.
Sure.
There's a great book Don Lattin wrote called The Harvard Psychedelic Club, which is a history of Harvard's psychedelic intersection much earlier.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, like how does the Harvard scene kind of relate to that history of Leary Alpert way back, Andy Weil and more? Like it's, intersection with Walter Pankey, the Good Friday experiments at Marsh Chapel. And there's so much happening here, because we're not far after Emerson Thoreau period. All this was happening here.
William James.
And James too.
Yeah.
Important stuff was happening here. And yeah, it's not just Leary Alpert. It's like a lot of stuff that fed into this whole milieu. Like I'm particularly asking about Leary Alpert. How do we kind of wrestle with that?
Great question. Well, let me first of all make a plug.
Sure.
Which is that Jeff Bro and Paul Gillis-Smith, who I mentioned before, have been part of it. I think there's a few other people, but they've put together a walking tour of the history of psychedelics at Harvard It is available on Spotify.
Great.
So you can just...
I was trying to do this like 6 years ago with Don Latin. I decided not to do it. I'm glad they're doing it.
They've done it, and I just took the tour with them last Thursday. They did it for a number of the people involved in the study. And I sometimes am tired of hearing about these characters,
Sure.
but this walking tour, to me, refreshed my interest in them, in part because they put it into a deeper history, including Emerson and William James, but also partly because they really humanized a lot of the characters. And they also brought out some characters that aren't part of the canonical history. A woman whose name, there you go, whose name escapes me, but you can find on the walking tour, who was part of Leary and Alpert's Harvard Psilocybin project, and whose role in it has been largely forgotten, but who was quite influential. So that was a really interesting chapter to have told. So I just want to recommend to listeners, go listen to that walking tour, and if you find yourself in Cambridge, take the walking tour. So about this particular story, I would say that I have found a little frustrating the way in which the psychedelic Renaissance so-called psychedelic Renaissance wants to understand itself as turning the page on Leary and Alpert and what is perceived as the excesses of the 60s psychedelics movement, not because I don't think there were excesses, but because it feels like it's a way of legitimizing contemporary psychedelic research and trying to cut off ties with the past. And my general stance is,
let's get the erasers out.
Yeah, let's get the erasers out. We have and I feel it's acutely here at Harvard, where of course the shadow of especially Leary looms large. And as we're embarking on this Harvard study, I want to say, we're not beholden to the tradition of Leary and Alpert, but also let's not just demonize and simplify them so as to pretend that there's nothing complicated or, about what we're doing now, right? So again, here I tip my hat to Jeff and Paul, who I think have, are perfectly happy with ambivalence and ambiguity in these stories and the ways in which the influences of what happened here in the 60s, first of all, just didn't stop with the prohibition, the legal case, but that there was all kinds of experimentation and exploration of psychedelics for decades. And I also just don't want to leave that behind.
Right.
So I would say I walked away from that tour thinking I would like to know this history better than I do. And Paul mentioned a novel by T.C. Boyle, which tells the history of psychedelics at Harvard.
That was the kind of fictionalized take.
Yeah, it's a fictionalized take, and he said it was
okay.
Oh, okay.
As far if you don't love Leary,
Yeah.
which I love Leary, it's brilliant fiction. I I kind of demonized him a little bit.
Oh, it does. Okay.
A little touch of that. But I read it with the book club of ladies who had no real taste for the psychedelic movement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying don't read it, but they all came away saying, "Oh, he was the worst person in history." That's kind of how my vibe was, and I'm sitting around trying to justify Leary to these people in some way. I'm like, it's not really how I want to spend my time. I highly recommend reading the book, though.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So I haven't read it yet. Mm-hmm. Paul recommended it, and whereas a number of people have not recommended Don Latin's book to me. So I don't know why, and I haven't read either yet. So there you have it.
Don Latin's is fine too. It's, we haven't had serious scholarship yet on these things, which I really hope people do. T.C. Boyle probably did the most scholarship, but he took a different spin. Yeah.
Well, and even as I recall, Michael Pollan's book, which kind of repeats the kind of canonical history of this period,
smears Leary so much.
Smears Leary, yeah.
Which, I haven't had Michael Pollan on the show yet.
Well, he's next.
Perhaps, maybe.
Yeah.
He'll have to ask nicely. The Leary stuff, I would love to see people dig more into that history, not whitewash it. There's so much left to learn. It's like let's ignore wide swaths of history because we have it all figured out now, which is not accurate at all, right? Like there's a lot we have to learn. We can learn from his mistakes and successes.
Mm-hmm.
Same way clinical trials can learn a lot from groups like the Native American Church or Luis Eduardo Luna or, all of these traditions worldwide. This is not just a new world situation. It's worldwide phenomenon, really.
I get the sense that you know a great deal more about this than I do. So I'm going to say something that may sound trivial by your standards, but I feel like as we move into the psychedelic above ground, there's a lot of interest in leaving behind the psychedelic underground. And sure. I do not feel that way. I feel like, again, I'm not intimately involved with the psychedelic underground. I don't know its history, but I feel more confident that there are a lot of lessons learned and wisdom carried in whatever we're calling the psychedelic underground than in some of the more above ground, peer-reviewed scientific or allegedly scientific studies that are currently driving popular interest in psychedelics.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions we could go here, right? Science is quite reductionist now, and we miss a lot of the plot by reducing things. So how do we bring back a lot of that value from the margins and make sure people are doing as well as they can with these things and in clinics and elsewhere in religions and hopefully getting hurt as little as possible. And if not hurt at all, but I don't know if that's in the cards. But yeah, there's a lot here, and it's really important. You brought up the term intersectionality earlier. Like you're doing clinical trials with the FDA as if these things are just another antibiotic or like a statin, and it's not the case. You're doing something very different, in my opinion. The FDA doesn't know what to do. They've got their hands full with this project.
Have you read this piece that Rachel Peterson published in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin? It's on challenging psychedelic experiences or bad trips, although she's trying to precisely to get us away from that category of bad trips. It's a really brilliant meditation on her own experience of an extraordinarily challenging experience on psilocybin, in her case, administered by the Johns Hopkins team. And then how frustrating it was to try to get that experience taken seriously. It's a brilliant piece. But for me, I just want to, I recommend everyone read that, and it's available online, Rachel Peterson, and it's at Harvard Divinity Bulletin. But also, just generally, I'm suspicious of efforts to try to excise what is challenging about psychedelic experiences, not because I wish to champion bad trips. To be honest, I've never had one, so it would be disingenuous of me to do that. But because if you put psychedelic experiences in the broader category of extraordinary experiences of transcendence and transformation, challenge, pain, and suffering is part of the grammar of transcendence and transformation. So to try to remove that from the grammar entirely seems to me ill-advised. Like, what wisdom can you glean if all of the difficulty is removed? And I just say that because I have heard people talking about engineering some of these substances in such a way as to take away essentially the trip-like quality of the journey, as if the therapeutic punch could be delivered without any of that.
Preach. Yeah, this is interesting. It's I don't know when this came into the world, right? It's maybe it's always been here, away from suffering towards pleasure, right? But as old as time, pain is kind of part of this transformational crisis. Like Jesus and Paul's thing, stories weren't very pain-free. Odin's thing wasn't very pain-free. Like, do you have a good definition of like ecstasy ecstasis?
Well, I mean, just the basic one of standing outside of oneself, being beside oneself.
Mhm.
But I think that maybe even a more general account would just be profoundly altered states of consciousness, perception, embodiment.
Mhm.
And maybe this is a good time for me to say, insofar as I'm interested in psychedelics, and I am interested in psychedelics, I'm interested in them as one of many ways of inducing what we'll call ecstasy, or soliciting, or pursuing altered states of consciousness, embodiment, and perception. But I would also say that I generally think it is a good idea that when one is pursuing altered states, one should know why one is pursuing altered states. I don't know that altered states are an end in themselves, or there's a real danger when people, I think, are just pursuing it because they wish to experience all ways of being altered. I think that's
It's not the first time that's been said on this show.
no, I know. I'm
Yeah.
sure. And look, a lot of
And I'm not cutting you down either.
Oh,
This
no,
is like
no,
a
no.
really brilliant person saying this.
Okay, well, great.
You might only need 2 or 3 of these things in your whole lifetime, maybe, depending on who you are.
Yeah, you may not need them in great frequency,
Mhm.
and they're also very different, as we all know, right? Experiences of transcendence and transformation are not. There's not a flat land of those. They're very different. Some of them can be profoundly challenging. Some of them can be profoundly blissful. And knowing how you are pursuing different kinds of experiences and to what end. What are you hoping to become? What are you hoping to see that you can't see? What are you hoping to become that you can't become? How are you hoping to be embodied in a way that you're not currently embodied? That requires what I would call kind of almost like a metaphysical frame, an ontological account. Here's why I'm pursuing transcendence and transformation. Maybe myth and metaphysics is better. A story and a kind of philosophy to hold these experiences.
Mhm.
And I feel like a lot of psychedelic enthusiasts, and maybe I'm just talking to too many partygoers, just feel like, oh, I don't really need that. Like, I just want to experience the altered state.
Mhm.
Like, okay, that's cool, but then don't pretend that there's no spirituality in just having a serial experiences of altered states. That's not a spirituality is, or to pursue a religious path is to be embedded in a story and to have an account of what the world is, what a human is, and to be after that. And I feel like that can change. The altered states can reform your myth and your metaphysics along the way. But if you go in thinking you don't need any myth or metaphysics, God bless you, good luck to you, but you're playing with fire. And not just psychedelics. You're playing with levels of reality within you and outside of you that require care and, as many traditions advocate, guidance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting frame, and I think people need to hear that more often. I have a fun intersection with that story. So I did, my philosophy undergrad. I did a lot of training in the Groff tradition, which has a lot of what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Like 6 years of breath work before I even jumped into the pool with psychedelics. And yeah, now my use, like I'm just so busy that, super intentional use, like in the, it's really interesting. Like I am one of these like party people, but
Partying's great.
but I have this whole like framework. So I'm bringing all that into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm learning, I'm doing a lot there, but it's different than just like pure, I call it gross hedonism, maybe. Like hedonism can be cool, but it's also like, if it's just raw and unfiltered, there's some problems that can come up for folks. And I personally wrestle with this kind of story, but I like how you're framing it.
This is important to dig into a bit. This is fascinating to me because I don't have maybe the deep well springs of experience, certainly not with psychedelics that you have, and that many of the listeners may have. And I do want to say I find the dismissal of recreational use ill-advised, like, or just silly. Especially like as Jeff has reminded me many times, and the very idea of recreation, that's a really potent term. If recreational use is actually recreating you, great.
Yeah.
And I also think I want to celebrate experimentation.
Sure.
And exploration. I don't mean to suggest that this has to be in some sort of lockstep tradition. Not at all. And the guidance that one can lean on doesn't necessarily need to be a church or a formal guide. My own most transcendent and transformative experiences, I shouldn't say my most, but many of my most transformative and transcendent experiences have come through long discipline of reading ancient texts. It's a really mind-bending practice, but it also means that the experiences are in dialogue with guides in a tradition. That's one way. There are many ways to be grounded. I wouldn't want to do this work entirely ungrounded.
Yeah, you can end up in prison or hurt.
Yeah.
A psych ward, which is super not fun.
Mad. Yeah.
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 Yeah, there's a lot there. It's I think that's well put. So as a religious scholar, how are you seeing this whole thing? I'm sure that's way too big of a question. So let's say over the last few years, what's been kind of the most interesting things from a religious perspective for you that you've kind of been paying attention to?
Well, the thing that I really find fascinating about psychedelics, and the reason I continue to follow this conversation, and insofar as I can help lead programming around it, is that people are consistently having extraordinary experiences that are enormously meaningful to them. And they're having those when if these are folks who are involved in traditional religious communities and paths, they're very often not having those kinds of experiences. So to me, that's a very interesting signal that in a lot of conventional religions, or a lot of conventional religious life is an experiential wasteland. There is not much happening. And then people have that punctuated with these experiences had by psychedelics. So that's important to me because it's, in some sense, it's a diagnosis of religion right now. Not all religions, but a lot of them. And I can speak more, comfortably about that in Christianity than in other traditions. But again, and I'll circle back to something we've already said, I feel as if it's probably best when people who've had those enormously significant experiences occasioned by psychedelics recognize that those experiences can be had by other means, have been had by other means. And I've found not only a tendency to psychedelic exceptionalism in this space, but also a tendency to psychedelic literalism in this case. You get psychedelic. Look, here are three things I feel like I'm constantly trying to avoid: psychedelic exceptionalism, psychedelic literalism, and psychedelic evangelism. And all three of those have a relationship to the history of Christianity: exceptionalism, literalism, and evangelism. But let me just stick with literalism. People have experiences on psychedelics and they think the world must literally be as I just experienced it, which is not the correct conclusion to draw from an extraordinary experience. You want that experience to begin to inform a new ontology that you have, a new sense of what reality might be, but recognizing that the signature of that experience will differ very differently from the signature of an experience on another psychedelic, or through holotropic breath work, or through reading ancient texts in an ancient language, or through dance. All of those experiences can change the way the world appears to you. It would be foolish to be literalist about any one of those experiences disclosing the nature of reality to you.
Mhm.
So you're constantly involved in a kind of interpretive dance, if you will. How do I take these experiences seriously, but not literally? How do they begin to inform what I think the human being is and the world we live in, but not to immediately literalize those accounts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking about similar concepts somewhat recently where people will have these revelations or like receive a text or something, like
Yeah.
channeling books. Like it's an interesting thing. I don't know what to make of it exactly, but the one thing that I've kind of come to is those, whatever they're receiving or doing, it's interfacing through your nervous system, your personal biographical material, whatever other kind of transpersonal elements might make you up, and then it's also whatever that thing is that's coming in. So it's kind of like multiple levels of filtering, and I think we could probably look at old text that way too, probably. So Paul probably wrote in some interesting ways because of his lived experience, and probably that's a really basic thing to say about anybody writing anything. So yeah, absolutely. It's always colored a bit.
That goes to, you use the language of filter, and that goes to the idea of the filter theory of the brain.
Right.
That the brain is there precisely to filter out a huge amount of mind at large, so that the consciousness we experience is limited so that we can conduct ourselves in the world, right?
Yeah, how are you farming if you're getting all the material?
Yeah, we don't need it all. We don't need everything all at once. Super
helpful to be able to reduce it all.
Yeah, super helpful to reduce it all, but that also comes at a great cost, because if you think that if the reductive valve has given you a stream, don't mistake that stream for the totality of consciousness. And when you or others around you experience fluctuations in that reduction valve, so that some other transmission comes through and your consciousness is altered or widened, recognize that that's okay. Such a thing can exist. It is part of mind at large. It doesn't necessarily mean that you or the other person is insane, right? You have to, and also not just that it could happen, but that you might begin to seek it out, explore it, try to widen the bandwidth of consciousness, recognizing that you're trying to widen it and still function in the world. But again, this comes back to myth and metaphysics. Why are you widening it? What do you want to see? And why? What do you want to experience and why?
We often try to help people by asking a lot of philosophical questions. Why are you here? Who are you?
Yeah.
Where do you come from? All these kinds of things. Like, is there meaning? What is meaning coming from? And I think those are really important frames to kind of insert at the beginning, because maybe somebody wants to pump the brakes if they're going a little too far.
Right.
Yeah. You're hot on the trail of truth. You're like, well, interesting, but maybe let's kind of read up on other theories of truth a little bit before that.
Truth is plural. What truth are you after? And how much of it do you want? How much of it do you want? How much of it can you hold? I think it's in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets where he says human beings can only, I'm paraphrasing him, but he can only tolerate so much reality.
Yes.
So know your limits.
Right. And this comes back to the bad trips thing a little bit. So I think it was Peterson who was part of the trial and dropped out, didn't complete the series maybe. It was either Jamie, Beachy, or Peterson. I forget which one.
No, I believe Rachel did both of the doses in the Johns Hopkins trial. And if I'm remembering correctly, she's talking about the first trip was sort of exactly what they want you to have.
Right.
And then the second was extraordinarily challenging.
Sure.
But I think she saw that through. We had another guest on that panel with Rachel, who was Rita Powell, but she did the religious professional study in New York and dropped out halfway. So, but I don't know, maybe Jamie Beachy also dropped out.
Right.
Or I shouldn't say dropped out, but like didn't complete the...
I'll try to get an interview with Jamie so she can speak to it in the future. But yeah, like this is like doing this stuff in a quote unquote safe clinical room.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a tough framework to be operating in. And yeah, Hopkins is really trying to do like the Hopkins branded experience in a lot of ways. Like this is the process and this is the experience we want you to have. And that's challenging and hard. And that's a gross generalization, everybody. Sorry, Hopkins, for saying that way. But it's, there's a sense in which that's super true. Yeah. And ecstasy is not always fun. Like it can be really painful to lose everything that you thought was yours, including your identity. Sometimes it's fine and easy. Sometimes it's brutal. I've had some really challenging experiences. I've had some beautiful, amazing experiences. And it's kind of, life amplified is how I frame it. It's not anything unique to psychedelics, like epileptic fits or whatever informed a lot of these religious experiences, or, they could be really painful and scary. Like I can imagine in a lot of the initiatic traditions, like there are some really harrowing things that they would force themselves to do, like the sun dance, for instance. Like that's no walk in the park. It's really painful, really serious. You might die. And there's so many traditions worldwide where people were potentially about to die before they became initiated into adulthood or something like that. Yeah, so it's not novel.
No, truth.
Yeah. So I think the religious stuff is probably where a lot of our value here is in this conversation. I'm kind of curious about, let's talk about Murarescu first.
Okay.
So because you spend a lot of time in the ancient Mediterranean world.
Yeah.
I think you're, well positioned to comment here. Murarescu in his book, as we kind of chatted about before, like he lays out this long story about how the Eleusinian mysteries went pan-Mediterranean in a sense. Like we have some evidence around that. And then that informing proto-Christianity. But we haven't yet found that bridge, if it exists at all, right?
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about this and how Murarescu maybe...
Yeah, so as I told you, Brian has become a friend of mine, and I'm very grateful to him in many ways because I was among those people, those scholars of the ancient world, who when anyone raised the psychedelic hypothesis just as a knee-jerk reaction, just dismissed it. Oh, you're just looking for... You're looking for evidence for your enthusiasm for psychedelics. So I needed to be persuaded, and he has absolutely persuaded me that we as scholars of the ancient world should be looking with all the means possible for evidence of psychedelics and their role in ancient religion. And I also think that with these new techniques, there's reason to hope that we will find more evidence. Archaeochemistry, the ability to discover what a vessel held, it's enormously powerful. Okay, so that's my gratitude to Brian. Now let's talk about the case he makes. So the book falls into two big parts. One is to try to explore the evidence for a psychedelic ingredient in the Eleusinian mysteries, the so-called kykeon, the potion that the initiates were supposed to drink at the climax or near the climax of their initiation, their long initiation. And then the other is whether there's any evidence for psychedelic use in early Christianity. So when you sort of distill the whole story that Brian tells down to its evidentiary core, what we find is there's no evidence yet of any psychedelic ingredient at Eleusis. None yet. There's reasons why we think that there might be evidence there, but we haven't found it yet. The only evidence we have is from a community in inland, off the coast near Barcelona in Catalonia. I can't remember the name of the community that founded this, but there's reason to believe that the hypothesis that they carried the Eleusinian potion with them and interacted with this indigenous to Spain group that were also using some psychoactive ingredients. So we have this evidence that somebody from the kind of Eleusinian orbit took this psychoactive technology to Spain. So that's indirect evidence that maybe this goes back to Eleusis. It's significant, but it's not exactly a smoking gun. When asked, I think we will probably find more evidence for psychedelic ingredients in the ancient Mediterranean world that is relevant to Eleusis and other religions. I think there's probably more evidence to be found. I am very skeptical that the evidence will fundamentally rewrite the history of ancient religion. I think that these are among the things that people were using to achieve altered states of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And whether they were using them or not may depend on whether those things were available to them where they lived or whether they knew how to use them. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a story to be told, but let's not exaggerate it. It is not that ancient religion is psychedelic. It is not the case that there is a hidden, as Brian said, a secret religion of psychedelia beneath the ancient religious landscape. I don't see any evidence of that. And then with respect to early Christianity, unfortunately, there is, to date, to my mind, not a shred of evidence, direct or indirect, that would suggest that the Eucharist was a psychedelic sacrament at mm-hmm. all. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to protect the Christian sacrament. I expect that at some point we will find an early Christian chalice where there's a psychedelic ingredient in it. That would not surprise me at all if someone found that tomorrow. That does not mean that early Christianity was psychedelic. It means we have evidence that one chalice had a psychedelic ingredient. It wouldn't surprise me at all if some groups experimented with that. But if you're talking about the kind of mainstream tradition and what the Eucharist, how the Eucharist functioned, what that ritual consisted of, I will be shocked to discover that was a psychedelic sacrament.
Right. I recently finally read Road to Eleusis. It was Ruck, Wasson, Hoffman.
Yeah.
I thought their argument was good enough, but I'm like, okay, this doesn't necessarily mean yes, for sure. I think there's absolutely evidence that people were getting high, religiously or otherwise. Like wine could be quite lethal. The stories about the different symposium, brews, it was always different. It was up to the host to figure out what they were going to serve. Like, that was pretty fascinating. There was evidence that Kikion was stolen here and there, or at least removed out of its sacramental context, but mm-hmm. we don't know much more than that. I think the ancient world was rife with drugs.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, I had a really fun conversation once with my classicist friend, Denise Demetrio, and a scholar of the Mongols at Princeton's IAS. And it was like, it was so fun to speculate about the drug trade between the East and the Mediterranean. And it wasn't just the drug trade, right? Ideas, language, all sorts of things. So really, really interesting pipeline there. So can you tell us like a little bit about ancient Mediterranean religion? Like, this is potentially right around when they started to go extinct. But these mystery rites, like, people had these experiences in, mm-hmm. in different traditions. And it's not just Eleusis, right?
Right.
There's a lot going on. And there's a chance there are potentially drugs involved, not just ritual and drama and things there.
I don't know where the state of scholarship is on psychedelics in the other mystery religions. Mm-hmm. If you think about like Mithraism, I just read a bunch of literature on Mithraism in my solar theology class. And I didn't
Which looks amazing, by the way. I saw that listing. I was like, oh, shit.
Yeah, it was
like
a fun class. Yeah, that was a fun class. Didn't see any evidence of psychedelics and Mithraism. So I really do think right now it seems focused on Eleusis.
Mm-hmm.
There is Walter Hanegraaff published a book on the Hermetic tradition and the historical imagination from Cambridge University Press. And he tries to reconstruct Hermeticism in Greco-Roman Egypt and is quite open to the idea that drugs were involved in Hermetic spirituality. But again, the evidence is thin, but not nothing. So people don't typically categorize Hermeticism as a mystery religion, but in any case, it's part of the same kind of ecosystem.
Seem far off, but yeah, ecosystem is a good way to put it.
So there's some evidence, or there's some scholarship on psychedelics and other more broadly psychoactive ingredients in that spirituality. What's called kufi is an incense in Egypt that Walter speaks about in that book, and there's a large literature on whether this incense in particular settings has a kind of psychoactive effect as well.
One of my friends was approached by ancient Egypt scholar with some recipes for Blue Lotus potions, and there's some interesting stuff there. He's gonna try the recipe out, so we'll report back on that.
Great, good luck to him.
Yeah.
Oh, the one that you might be interested to, which your listeners might be just curious to hear about. Again, Walter wrote a great chapter on it, but there's something called the Mithras liturgy, which is neither really about Mithras nor liturgy. It's basically it's a spell. It's an account of how to perform a ritual of ascent to the sun to achieve immortality. It comes from the Greek magical papyri, and in part of the ritual involves the preparation of an eye ointment, so that when you ascend to a certain stage in this ritual, you can see the gods in the sun. So it's quite detailed account of how you prepare this eye ointment. But no, I believe there are one or two ingredients that no one can identify. I myself, I value my eyes very much. I don't know that I would want to try this, but if you have daring friends, there's a psychedelic eye ointment out there waiting to be cornered and tried.
Yeah, be careful, folks. But yeah, let me know if you do try it. So why do you think it's the case that the psychedelic movement wants so badly for the Eleusinian mysteries to have been psychedelic?
Oh, well, I think maybe somebody could give me a more complicated answer to this, but it seems to me that the psychedelic community wants legitimacy. And one of the ways that you get legitimacy is that you say that this substance, humans have had a long history of working with this substance. And in fact, more legitimacy if you can say, and in fact, that going back to ancient Greece or early Christianity, that this gives us a great legitimacy. I mean, Brian's own book trades in this in a way that I'm critical of him, because he keeps speaking of the beginning of Western civilization, right? As if Eleusis and the early Christian sacrament were the pillars upon which Western civilization were built. But in any case, it seems to me the obvious answer is people want precedent. People want to say that they're in a lineage that goes back to antiquity. And, the psychedelic use, although it seems to be more and more licit and accepted, is still stigmatized. So I assume that that's the case, but maybe you can answer it more in a more nuanced fashion. What do you think is going on?
I think that's spot on. We want legitimacy. We're kind of like still hiding from law enforcement, the federal establishment, and other places, right? It's like so people are using the religious angle now, starting churches, which, get cover where you can. Guys, prison's probably not super fun. I don't know yet. I hope to not know.
Yeah, I hope not to know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? There's like this mystical experience can be so big. There's plenty of ways to get it, folks, but the psychedelics are one of them. But yeah, it's big, it's important. It can convince people of all sorts of interesting things, can calm your fear of death in some instances. There's so much value there for folks, and they want that. They want others to understand it. And this might be the evangelizing component.
Mm-hmm.
We see this in the clinical trials all the time. People come out and they want to help everybody because the experience was so convincing, which sounds a little bit like Eleusis kind of, but we came back transformed and better, and my pain's gone, and I can actually read a storybook to my kids, and like whatever that is, I no longer want to kill myself, and if I want to get that basic, and then we want others to not suffer so much with these things that we now believe are easy answers to their problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy answer, everybody. It's a long path. We're kind of like medicalizing this stuff when it's really probably just part of the human experience. But anyway, we're trying to not be so afraid of our governments and our communities. Yeah, and I'm very out. I was not so out not that long ago, but it was a scary step because all of a sudden, not just incarceration, but am I going to be able to re-enter my former profession if things go belly up here, which I don't believe will happen. But yeah, like, am I just throwing all my cards on the table? And the only reason is stigma and in some cases, legally enforced stigma.
Mm-hmm.
That, I like to bring it full circle, kind of Carl Hart-esque here. And like the drug war in America was started for racist means. And the DEA themselves have admitted it recently in their museum in Virginia. And I was in DC recently. I tried to go. It was still closed for COVID. But next time, I'll get some photos to share. But it's a complicated ball of wax. But I think you mostly nailed it. Like, and long histories of use is a way to get legitimacy. Science is a way to get legitimacy. Religion is, it's hard for me as like a, Grateful Dead fish person. Like, that's not really going to buy me much legitimacy anywhere.
Right.
But I can lean on studies to help make my arguments, and that's helpful. It's like, it's a pain in the ass. It's obnoxious to have to live that way.
I've noticed this among psychedelic enthusiasts in the Bay Area who are, mostly, but not exclusively, Christians and Jews. And the interest in, I think a lot of these folks have had really profound experiences that have then forced questions upon them about how do they relate to the religious traditions they come from. Some Christians, or even if they are Christians only culturally, feel like, well, I can leave Christianity behind, and they kind of migrate into the, the marketplace of spirituality and
never heard it put that way. I love that.
and dabble in, and dabble in indigenous or pseudo-indigenous traditions. Some want to stay Christian, and so then arguments about an early Christian psychedelic sacrament are enormously appealing. But I've noticed this more often with Jewish seekers who've had profound psychedelic experiences, who do not want to leave Judaism behind, do not think that the lesson of this experience is, oh, I'm no longer a Jew, or I no longer need to be engaged with Judaism. But in fact, it kind of reinvigorates their interest in the tradition. And some of those folks, I think, are drawn to the idea that early Judaism has evidence of psychedelic use. So the classic place people go are the visions of the prophets, which are wild.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, Ezekiel's vision is very, very, it's very wild. I don't find that convincing that you can somehow just read off the page of Ezekiel that he's had a wild vision. Oh, this must have been induced by a psychedelic. No, not at all is that even remotely convincing to me. I think what is convincing to me is, let's talk about the importance of extraordinary experience in this tradition and the variety of ways one may get there. And if you, a contemporary person, has found your way there through psychedelics, that's interesting. But then you don't need to try to make Ezekiel the same. You don't need to attribute to Ezekiel that same mode. He had his own modes. And I think in some ways, it's also a way of narrowing the discipline and practice of transcendence and transformation. Because if you can say that I've had this significant experience and it was occasioned by psychedelics, and then you want to convince yourself that all these other extraordinary experiences were occasioned by psychedelics, then you don't need to invest in all of the other practices of transcendence and transformation: breath work, study, fasting, sleep deprivation, postural yoga, whatever, I'm just naming some of the more obvious: dance, drumming, music. All of these are other things that bring on into states. If you want to say everything is reducible to a psychedelic experience, saves you a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm somewhat involved in Hermetic traditions, and the amount of study and work required for transcendence in those traditions is astronomical relative to your once a week Christian service. It's
right.
and what's interesting is the attitudes of Hermetic folks that are deep students, practitioners towards the psychedelic movement. It's a fascinating sort of belittling of the psychedelic movement, which is sometimes quite justified, because with like deep study and community, your standalone psychedelic experience alone in suburban America with no real connection to deep lineages, like there's no real good comparison. So I think you might be able to hit similar states,
yeah,
but the lasting effect of those states might be, let's say, potentially dangerous and potentially not all that helpful or useful or informative.
I mean, I generally, more than generally, I agree with that sentiment, Joe, but I wonder also whether you feel like there's an underlying issue, which is people want to measure themselves against other people.
Absolutely.
All the time.
I'm so much better than you.
Yeah. You had a big experience. Oh, I don't need to feel challenged by your big experience because I'm really learned.
I was seeing ego death contests on Reddit somewhat recently. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah. Well, my ego is bigger, so its death was more significant than yours. Or, I've been involved in meditation for 30 years, and so I'm not, your experience is insignificant compared to a life of practice. I'm sympathetic to a lot of these logics, but I also think that you need to step back and say, why are we so obsessed with measuring ourselves over and against others to protect the presumed supremacy of my path? And I know this because I have the reaction sometimes. I'm quite learned. I don't know if you know this, but I'm quite learned, and so I can look down on.
You've never read it in the original Greek.
Yeah, exactly. And then you check yourself and you say, "What?" I know a lot of people who can read things in the original Greek, and it does not yield wisdom, right? It does not yield transformation. So why am I marshaling that? So I don't know. Maybe I sound platitudinous here, but I have found that wisdom and insight are quite evenly distributed across both an experiential bandwidth and a bandwidth of practice and learning. I find people with wisdom and insight popping up across that landscape. It is not consistently the case that the most learned blow me away, nor the people who've had the most crazy experiences. I often find them really boring.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes someone will say something and it really arrests me. So anyway, humility, that's a good Christian virtue that Christians have not consistently practiced, but is, I think, a great virtue to tout in this space.
Mm-hmm.
Humility and curiosity.
So as a way of winding down here, and a big question for last is, religion's quite, at least in the slices of America I see, it's not really looked upon as a good thing often, but it's played an extraordinarily important part in human history. Like what is it about religion that's like important to us? And maybe how does that relate to our current kind of larger quagmires?
Well, just so I understand the question,
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking about just generally?
Broadly.
What is compelling or interesting about
like
religion?
why is it helpful to humanity? Why is it still helpful to humanity today? We know it's played a huge role historically, but today is there still value? I think so, but what is that value?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a way that might annoy your listeners.
Perfect.
Which is to say, I don't think the question of religion's utility is the right question, because it presumes that humans and human use is at the center of our inquiry. I think religion will not go away because I believe in the reality of the sacred. To put that in the language of the ancient world, I think it's important for humans to attend to religion because the gods are real. So I feel that, there's this old term, homo religiosus, religious human. Man is by nature religious. But I think that there's a layer behind that, which is to say reality includes the sacred. And we are not the only agents in our world. There are persons, powers beyond us communicating with us. So I feel that religion will continue to be important because those powers and persons will continue to be trying to speak in and through us. I think humans are much more than we take them to be, and I think the world is much more than we typically take it to be. So sorry, I'm sort of going on and on by saying I think the history of religion is important, not only for historical purposes. I think the history of religion is important because I think religion is describing imperfectly, but quite powerfully, the nature of reality. And I think humans do best when they do not shield themselves from the real. And I think flatland materialism, scientific reductionism, and all of the forms of reductionism that also predominate in the humanities shield us from the real. And religion helps widen our lens.
I love that. Yeah. And this is what folks like Luis Eduardo Luna are telling us about from stories from the Amazon. And we see it in ancient Mediterranean. And this has been from time immemorial, sort of commerce with the non-human.
Commerce with the more than human is real because the more than human is real. The more than human can be animals, plants, fungi, stones, gods, demons, angels, spirits, and innumerable things for which we have imperfect language. Those persons, those powers are real. And I don't think you need to go to South America or the ancient Mediterranean. I spent a lot of time in the woods in New England, and I know those persons and powers there. These spirits of place are available in every place. So that's what I think religion is. Learning how to live with and communicate with and commune with the more than human.
Beautiful. All right. I think that's a great place to stop.
Fantastic.
So how can people follow what's going on here at the center?
Sure. If you go onto the center's website, there is, I think it's, you scroll down near the bottom, there's a very obvious place to sign up to the newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're interested in the center's broad programming, that's the place to go. If you're interested in psychedelic specific programming, if you go to the Harvard Study of Psychedelics and Society and Culture website, there are places to sign up for more specific psychedelic related series.
Beautiful. And finally, you have some books you're working on.
Yeah.
Can you plug those briefly?
Yeah, sure. Oh God, if I ever get around to writing again. I'm working on 2 books of my own right now. One is a history of fire in the ancient world, the imagination of fire and philosophy and religion in the ancient Mediterranean world. It's a vast book, the first installation of which will be called Gods of Fire. I'll try to tell the story through half a dozen Greek gods. And then I'm also writing a book about, tentatively titled Philosophy's Demons, which is about ancient philosophy from Socrates forward, and its understanding of how the demon or the daimon, the spirit that is somehow uniquely related to you, is part of the philosophical enterprise. So it's a story about how did this tradition of philosophy think about the daimon, and then when did that aspect of philosophy get forgotten, suppressed, and what are the consequences of that loss?
Brilliant. Yeah. Well,
Fire and Demons is what I'm working on.
Demons. Well, I'll be on the pre-order list. That sounds perfect.
You and my immediate family.
Professor Charles Stang, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure, Joe. Thank you so much.
All right. That was Professor Charles Stang. I hope you all liked that one and got some interesting morsels out of it. I think there is some great material, highly relevant to the psychedelic space. So, yeah, I really hope we are able to get Professor Stang back on the show. And there's so much of interest there. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Please share with friends and family if it's of interest to them, probably. And we will see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off. Bye-bye.